The airport pulsed with movement, alive with hurried footsteps and overlapping announcements that echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings. Tension hung in the air like humidity before a storm, passengers darting between gates, parents juggling restless children, business travelers murmuring into phones, and agents barely keeping up behind check-in counters. But then, something happened. Something sharp, something loud. A sudden clang cut through the chaos like a crack of thunder. It wasn't metal against metal. It was more personal jarring. A cane had been knocked from someone's grip and clattered hard against the polished tile floor, reverberating like a warning bell. Heads turned. Conversations halted. Even the loudspeaker fell into a brief hush. An elderly woman stood near gate 14, her hands trembling as she instinctively raised them in front of her chest. Her pale blue eyes widened, filled with a startled mix of fear and disbelief. At her feet lay the cane she had leaned on moments before. Across from her, a flight attendant stood rigid, glaring. Her name tag read Caroline Whitmore, its metallic shine cold under the harsh fluorescent lights. Caroline's arms were folded across her chest, her jaw tight. Her words came sharp, clipped, and far too loud for the moment. "I told you already, step aside, you're holding up the line. First class isn't meant for people like you." A gasp rippled through the terminal, like wind through leaves, not because of the words themselves, but because of how casually, how confidently they were spoken, as if humiliation was policy, as if exclusion came standard with a uniform. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, weighty with disbelief. People stopped walking. Some passengers turned away awkwardly. Others looked on, eyes darting between the woman and the attendant, unsure whether to intervene. But the elderly woman, Meredith Winslow, did not respond with outrage or tears. Her hand, though trembling, lowered slowly to her side, her back straightened ever so slightly. She said nothing. That silence made the moment even more unbearable. Grace, a younger flight attendant nearby, looked horrified. Her hands fidgeted, gripping the passenger manifest, as if trying to ground herself in something real. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. Perhaps she was afraid, or perhaps she knew exactly who that woman was. Carolyn, emboldened by the lack of response, scoffed and turned to the next passenger with mechanical cheer. "Next in line, please." No one moved. Then a man in a sharp navy suit stepped forward, holding out a boarding pass. But his eyes weren't on Caroline, they were fixed on Meredith. "Ma'am," he said softly, offering his arm. "Would you like to go ahead of me?" His voice broke the spell. Others began to murmur, first low, then louder. Someone near the back pulled out their phone. The camera lens glinted in the overhead light like a silent witness. Caroline glanced around, realizing too late that something had shifted. Still, Meredith didn't take the offered arm. She bent slowly, retrieved her cane with quiet grace, and held her place in line. "I'm quite all right," she said, her voice calm and clear. "I know where I'm going." Her dignity stood in stark contrast to the cold efficiency around her. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence said more than any outburst could. For a fleeting moment, even Caroline seemed unsure of herself, but her pride refused to yield. "If you cause another scene, I'll have to call security," she warned. Meredith simply turned to face her. Not with anger, but with a look that saw through the facade. A look that spoke of experience, of resilience, of someone who had been through far worse and come out standing. And right there amid the tension and hushed whispers was the first sign that this wouldn't be just another flight. Sometimes a story doesn't need fireworks to begin. It just needs a moment where someone dares to stand quietly with all the strength in the world. If you've ever witnessed quiet courage like this, or believe in standing up without saying a word, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe and share the story with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps stories like these reach hearts that need them. The tension lingered in the air long after the line resumed. Conversations returned in hushed tones as if the terminal itself was trying to process what had just happened. Yet through it all, Meredith Winslow walked forward with steady poise, her cane tapping gently against the floor, each step as deliberate as a heartbeat. Inside the jet bridge, Caroline strode ahead with clipped heels and tight lips. She didn't look back, though. The weight of curious eyes followed her like shadows, Grace following behind, bitter lip, and kept glancing at Meredith. Her instincts screamed that something wasn't right, not with the situation and not with the woman they had nearly humiliated. Passengers boarded with the usual flurry of luxury silk scarves, leather carry-ons, perfumes that cost more than rent. But even amid the elegance of the first-class cabin, a subtle shift had begun. Several of the travelers who had witnessed the earlier moment now watched with a different awareness. Whispers passed like static glances, exchanged like folded notes. Caroline, maintaining her polished routine, stood near the galley, checking seat numbers with brisk precision. She called out greetings, adjusted champagne flutes, and nodded without warmth. Yet when Meredith stepped inside the cabin, everything slowed again. Her presence was quiet but commanding, like a still lake that reflects everything around it, with unsettling clarity. She walked past the aisle with calm assurance, cane in one hand, handbag in the other, and paused at seat 1A. That caught Caroline off guard. "Ma'am," she said sharply, "approaching this seat is reserved for—" "I know," Meredith interrupted gently. "It's my seat." Caroline froze, confused, then frowned. She leaned in to glance at the boarding pass, expecting perhaps to see a mistake, but her breath caught when she saw it. Wait, first class confirmed. She said nothing, only gave a tight, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome aboard." Meredith offered a quiet nod and seated herself with the grace of someone who belonged, because she did. Not just in that seat, but in any room she chose to enter. Across the aisle, a businessman who had offered his arm earlier gave her a respectful nod. Others who had seen the scene unfold kept watching, curiosity deepening into admiration. They didn't know who she was, but they sensed she was someone worth knowing. Grace arrived with a warm towel and a softer smile. "May I offer you anything, Miss Winslow?" "Just a glass of water, thank you," Meredith replied. "And perhaps a moment of stillness before we take off." Grace smiled. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Carolyn stood stiffly near the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. Something about this didn't sit right. She'd seen all types of passengers over the years. Executives, celebrities, even royalty. But this woman, she had an aura she couldn't place. Something in the way she moved, the way others reacted to her. It was unsettling. She turned toward Grace. "Do you know her?" Grace hesitated. "No, but I think we're about to." Before Caroline could respond, the cockpit door opened and the captain stepped out, briefly scanning the cabin. His gaze stopped when it landed on Meredith and his expression changed. He approached her seat with the kind of respect reserved for dignitaries. "Miss Winslow," he said warmly, "we're honored to have you on board today." Caroline blinked. Grace's eyes widened. Meredith looked up with a soft smile. "Thank you, Captain. It's good to see familiar skies again." The captain gave a respectful nod before returning to the cockpit. Caroline's heart skipped. Something wasn't adding up. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who was this woman? Why hadn't anyone told her? And why had she so publicly treated her as if she didn't belong? The realization crept in slowly like rising water. And Caroline, for the first time that day, didn't know what to do. The first-class cabin settled into a heavy hush as the flight attendants moved through final checks. Seatbelts clicked into place, tablets powered down, and champagne glasses were collected with the care of museum artifacts. Yet all the while, Caroline's thoughts spun wildly, her composure fraying beneath the surface. She paced briskly down the aisle, pretending to check overhead bins, her mind a storm of questions. How could she have missed this? Who was this woman who carried herself with the grace of royalty and the respect of the flight captain? A small part of her hoped it was coincidence. Maybe the captain simply recognized her as a frequent flyer. But deep down, she knew better. It wasn't about loyalty points or mileage status. It was the way people looked at her, as if her presence alone changed the tone of the room. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Caroline resumed her position at the front of the cabin. She threw one last glance toward Meredith, who sat peacefully by the window watching the world blur past. Wheels lifted, engines roared. The city below melted into clouds. In the stillness of the climb, Caroline busied herself preparing service carts with robotic efficiency, but her hands were stiffer now, her movements lacking their usual precision. Every so often, her eyes drifted to seat 1A, unable to look away for long. Grace, meanwhile, moved through the motions with surprising calm. She offered each guest a warm smile, her voice gentle and steady. When she reached Meredith's row again, she paused. "Would you like anything else, Ms. Winslow? A meal, another drink?" Meredith shook her head with a kind smile. "I'm quite content." "Thank you." Her voice was soft, but there was power in it. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that earns it simply by existing. Caroline approached with a tray of bottled waters and cloth napkins. Her expression was unreadable, neutral, but tight around the eyes. As she reached Meredith's row, she hesitated. Then with effort, she extended the tray. "Water." Meredith glanced up, her tone still warm. Yes, please. Caroline placed the bottle down without looking her in the eye. Let me know if you need anything else, she said barely above a whisper. As she turned to walk away, Meredith spoke quietly but clearly. Ms. Whitmore, Caroline froze. She turned back slowly. Yes, you may want to take a moment. You look like you're carrying something heavy. There was no malice in her voice, no condescension, just an observation delivered with compassion that felt far too generous for someone who had just been disrespected. On the ground, Caroline blinked. I thank you, she murmured, unsure what else to say. She moved down the aisle, her footsteps suddenly slower. In the galley, she gripped the edge of the counter again, her reflection staring back at her from the metal cabinet. For the first time in years, she didn't like what she saw behind her. Grace leaned in. You all right? Caroline didn't respond at first. Then, barely audible, she whispered, I think I messed up. Grace said nothing, but her silence said everything. Across the cabin, Meredith resumed watching the clouds, her face calm and distant as if she'd already moved on. But the seeds had been planted, the shift had begun, and soon the truth, quiet, powerful, and unmistakable, was going to come to light. Cruising altitude was reached. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft golden hue over the space as flight attendants moved into mid-flight service. Clinking utensils, murmured conversations, and the occasional rustle of blankets created a serene background hum. Yet for Caroline, the quiet did little to ease the noise inside her. She watched Meredith discreetly from the galley doorway, noting the way the older woman reclined with calm confidence, completely unfazed by her surroundings. It was the kind of stillness born from a life well lived and deeply understood. And Caroline, for all her years in the skies, felt suddenly small in comparison. The passenger manifest still sat on the counter beside her. She'd checked it a dozen times already, hoping to find some hint, some clue to confirm what her gut already told her. But the name Meredith Winslow stared back plainly. No title, no flashing indicator, but the more she thought about it, the more her hands began to tremble. There was something she had once overheard in a crew briefing months ago. A mention of a new silent stakeholder. Someone who had recently acquired a large portion of the airline in a confidential deal. The details had been hush-hush. All anyone knew was that it was a woman. Private, powerful, anonymous, and now for the first time Caroline feared she had just crossed the very person whose influence extended far beyond any uniform or crew manual. She moved slowly through the cabin, checking in on other guests while her mind spun. Meanwhile, Grace made another pass through the rows, offering dessert selections. She stopped at seat 1A and smiled. We have a lovely pistachio tart or warm apple crumble tonight. May I tempt you? Meredith chuckled softly. The tart sounds divine. Thank you. Grace nodded, disappearing briefly before returning with a porcelain plate and a gold-rimmed fork. She placed it carefully in front of Meredith and leaned in slightly, her voice low. I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier, and I'm sorry. You deserve better. Meredith looked up at her, not with surprise, but with gentle understanding. Thank you for saying that, Grace. It means a great deal. Grace straightened, clearly affected. She nodded and stepped away, her face a mixture of admiration and quiet shame on behalf of her colleague. Back near the galley, Caroline watched the exchange from a distance. Something inside her cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to make her question the foundation she'd built her pride upon. Moments later, she was called to assist with a tray stuck in the rear compartment. A minor task. But when she returned to the first-class cabin, everything had changed. A man in an expensive charcoal gray suit had entered from the cockpit hallway, walking with measured steps. He wasn't a pilot or part of the crew. He wore no badge, but everyone who saw him instantly knew he held authority. He stopped at Meredith's seat. Ms. Winslow, he said respectfully, we've made the arrangements as discussed. The documents are finalized. You'll have full access when we land. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. Meredith looked up and gave the man a brief nod. Thank you, Mr. Langley. That will be all for now. He gave a short bow, and turned to leave. The ripple this caused through the cabin was immediate and sharp. Caroline's stomach dropped. Grace, standing near the bulkhead, stared in quiet awe. And for the first time, even the passengers who had kept their heads down looked up, truly looked, and began to understand Meredith Winslow wasn't just a well-dressed traveler with calm eyes and quiet dignity. She was someone powerful, someone important, and Caroline had treated her like an inconvenience. The air suddenly felt colder, her collar tighter. She turned toward the galley, her pulse racing. Inside her hands gripped the counter, knuckles white. She didn't know exactly who Meredith was, but she now knew enough, and her mistake was no longer a private shame. It was about to become a public reckoning. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted entirely. Conversations had dulled to whispers. The clink of cutlery seemed louder than usual. Even the soft chime from the flight deck announcing smooth skies couldn't shake the tension now lingering in the first-class section. Caroline stood frozen just behind the curtain, separating the galley, hands clasped tightly in front of her eyes, darting nervously towards seat 1A. She tried to replay the boarding scene in her head to convince herself she had acted within procedure. After all, she'd followed protocol. Hadn't she? She was just doing her job, maintaining order. That's what she'd tell herself, but it was a lie she could no longer believe. Because deep down, she remembered the tone she used, the way she looked at Meredith, like she didn't belong. And now, with every minute that passed, that same woman was slowly, silently revealing a level of authority that made Caroline's chest constrict with unease. From the opposite aisle, Grace moved with quiet efficiency, offering coffee refills and folded blankets. But there was something in the way she now glanced toward Meredith, something almost reverent. It wasn't just respect. It was recognition. Caroline watched as the businessman in seat 2C leaned toward Meredith. "I don't mean to pry, Ms. Winslow," he said, voice low, "but are you who I think you are?" Meredith smiled politely, her hands folded in her lap. "That depends." "Who do you think I am?" The man chuckled awkwardly. "I've attended a few shareholder meetings in the last year. There was talk of a new controlling interest joining the board. Someone anonymous, private, but rumored to be formidable." Meredith tilted her head slightly. "People say many things." He paused, then nodded respectfully. "Understood. Either way, it's an honor to share this flight with you." She gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." Caroline's throat felt dry. She turned away, hoping to escape the rising tension. But as she stepped into the galley, she found herself face to face with Grace, who had just returned from assisting in the economy cabin. They locked eyes. The silence between them said more than words ever could. "I think you should apologize," Grace said gently. Caroline blinked, caught off guard. "What? You heard me." Caroline looked away. "I'm not sure that would fix anything now." "It's not about fixing," Grace replied. "It's about owning what happened." Caroline didn't answer, but something in her posture softened. A flicker of humility broke through the tight armor of pride she had worn all day. Moments later, she stepped back into the aisle, her movements slower, measured not out of duty, but out of something deeper. Guilt. She approached Meredith's seat cautiously, her eyes not quite meeting the older woman's. "Ms. Winslow," she said softly, her voice noticeably lower than earlier. "I wanted to extend my sincerest apology for how I treated you at the gate." Meredith turned to her, composed and calm. "You've remembered my name." She noted her tone even. "Yes, ma'am. And I realize I should have treated you with respect regardless of it." The cabin seemed to grow quieter, as if the moment pulled attention like gravity. Even the businessman in 2C subtly leaned back, giving them space. Meredith took a long pause before responding. "I appreciate the apology," she said, "but respect should never depend on who someone is or what seat they're in." Caroline's cheeks flushed. "You're right." She stood silently for a beat longer, then stepped away, leaving Meredith once again in peaceful silence. But the weight of those words clung to her like static. Respect should never depend on who someone is. And for the first time in her career, Caroline felt the true meaning of service, not just hospitality, but humility. In that quiet cabin amid soft lights and gentle engine hum, a lesson had been delivered, not through lectures or consequences, but through grace, poise, and presence. And though Meredith had not raised her voice, every person who witnessed that moment would remember it long after the wheels touched down. The cabin lights had dimmed further now, signaling the transition into the evening phase of the flight. Outside the windows, the sky was ink blue, streaked with fading hues of gold as the sun slipped beneath the clouds. Inside, passengers nestled into blankets or reclined their seats, settling into a quiet rhythm of rest. But Meredith Winslow remained wide awake. Her gaze stayed fixed on the view beyond the glass, though her thoughts wandered elsewhere, beyond the flight, beyond the soft chime of seatbelt signs, or the aroma of reheated meals. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. She had lived through enough boardrooms, closed-door meetings, and silent assumptions to know how often judgment came before understanding. Yet even with her experience, it still stung when it happened face to face. Across the aisle, Grace quietly picked up used dishes and laid fresh towels at sleeping passengers' sides. Occasionally, her eyes flicked back toward Meredith, not out of obligation now, but out of genuine admiration. When she finally returned to the galley, she found Caroline seated on the jump seat, elbows on her knees, head low. "She accepted your apology," Grace said softly. Caroline gave a tired nod. "She did, but I can't shake this feeling." Grace sat down beside her, letting the silence stretch. "She didn't just forgive me," Caroline added after a pause. "She taught me something without raising her voice, without needing to prove anything." Grace folded her arms. "That's what real leadership looks like." Caroline exhaled slowly. "I thought I knew what power was. I thought it came with titles, orders, control. But she made me feel more accountable with one sentence than any supervisor ever has." "You're not the first person to misjudge a quiet woman," Grace replied gently. "But you have a chance now to remember her the next time you see someone who doesn't look like they fit the seat." The words hung in the air between them, soft but sharp. Caroline didn't respond right away. But when she looked up again, there was something new in her expression. Not shame, not fear, but awareness. Meanwhile, in 1A, Meredith finally leaned back and closed her eye. For the rest of the flight, no one disturbed her. When the captain's voice came through the intercom hours later, announcing the descent and weather conditions at the destination, most passengers stirred slowly, stretching and gathering their things. Caroline and Grace moved through the final checklist with practiced ease. But this time, Caroline's glances towards seat 1A held something different. Not suspicion, not fear, but quiet respect. As the wheels touched down with a gentle thud, applause broke out from a few rows back, an old tradition among travelers. Meredith opened her eyes, adjusted her scarf, and smiled softly to herself. The flight may have landed, but something much more meaningful had taken off. When the cabin doors opened and the jet bridge connected, the ground crew stood at the ready. But this time, a member of the airline's executive staff was waiting too, a man in a tailored suit holding a folder and scanning the first-class doorway with anticipation. When Meredith stepped out of the cabin, he straightened Ms. Winslow. He greeted with a respectful nod. "Your car is ready, the boardroom is prepped, and the press release has been approved, pending your signature." Passengers exiting behind her slowed, overhearing just enough to widen their eyes. Caroline stood frozen near the galley entrance, watching as the older woman she had dismissed so easily now walked off the plane with the quiet command of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Grace came to stand beside her. "That's her, isn't it?" Caroline whispered. "The one they said bought in last quarter." Grace nodded slowly. "She doesn't just own a seat in first class. She owns a piece of the sky." The terminal bustled with life as passengers spilled out into the waiting area, dragging designer luggage behind them and tapping away on their phones. Some were whisked off by chauffeurs, others navigated toward connecting flights. But those who had been on Flight 382 continued casting subtle glances at the woman who had just walked ahead of them with quiet authority. Meredith Winslow didn't rush. She walked with intention, flanked now by two airline representatives in discreet navy suits. The man holding the leather folder spoke softly into a headset, coordinating a sleek black car that had just pulled up outside the private arrivals area. Meanwhile, Caroline stood frozen just beyond the jet bridge, her uniform immaculate, yet her inner world shaken. She had thought the flight was just another leg in her schedule, routine, predictable. But somewhere between departure and landing, her definition of dignity of power had been rewritten. Grace approached from the side clipboard in hand, but her eyes lingered on the glass wall through which they could still see Meredith, being greeted by another executive with an envelope and a handshake. "You think she'll say something to the board?" Caroline asked quietly, almost afraid to voice the thought. Grace took a moment before answering. "She already did." Without a single report, Caroline nodded slowly, understanding. Some lessons didn't need disciplinary action. Some were delivered in silence with clarity that echoed far louder. Suddenly, a low murmur rolled through the crew's comm system. A private company-wide memo had just gone out. Grace checked her phone and blinked, then showed the screen to Caroline. Memo. Title ownership announcement. Miss Meredith Winslow, Executive Chair, Global Air Holdings. Caroline's breath caught. The message included an internal press release stating that Meredith Winslow had acquired majority shares through a holding company over the past fiscal year. She wasn't just a passenger. She was now the principal decision-maker for the entire airline. Beneath the announcement was a quote, her quote, "True service begins when ego ends. We fly not only to move people, but to elevate humanity." Caroline read it twice, then once more. The words didn't feel corporate, they felt true. And in them, she saw the very reflection of the woman she had tried to dismiss at the gate just hours earlier. "I don't know if I deserve to wear this uniform anymore," she whispered. Grace looked at her calm but firm. "Maybe not as the person you were yesterday, but maybe as the person you are becoming." Caroline turned back toward the window where Meredith was now stepping gracefully into the awaiting vehicle. The car pulled away, disappearing into the gentle twilight beyond the terminal's curve. And still she didn't feel gone. She felt present in every corner of that airport where someone might think twice before judging based on appearances. Present in every crew member who would remember her story, not because she demanded attention, but because she changed the room without raising her voice. Later that evening, as Caroline returned to her apartment and hung up her jacket with more care than usual, she paused by the mirror. She looked at herself not through the lens of title or routine, but with a newfound clarity, and whispered, "We fly not only to move people, but to elevate humanity." Days passed. The story of Flight 382 didn't make the headlines. There was no viral video, no dramatic outburst caught on camera, but somehow quietly it traveled. Among crew circles, it was whispered with a kind of reverence. The flight where an unassuming woman in seat 1A shifted the culture of an entire airline. Without ever needing to declare who she was, Meredith Winslow returned to her offices in the top floors of the Global Air Holdings headquarters, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over a horizon of glass towers and distant runways. But she didn't return with vengeance nor with a list of names. She returned with a purpose. In the weeks that followed, a quiet transformation began to unfold across the company. Internal policies were reviewed, not because of complaints, but because someone at the table believed in doing better. Diversity trainings were restructured. The onboarding program was rewritten with empathy in mind, and new core values were placed in every break room, etched not in polished metal, but in plain language. Everyone who steps aboard our aircraft deserves to be seen, heard, and respected. At the bottom of each plaque was a small signature, MW. And though most employees never met her face to face, her initials alone began to mean something more. As for Caroline, she didn't quit. She didn't flee from her mistake. Instead, she leaned into it. She volunteered for retraining. She requested to shadow senior staff in the executive cabin, not to supervise, but to listen. And when new recruits joined the airline, she shared the story, not sanitized, not embellished, but exactly as it happened. She told them about the woman who changed her without scolding her, who gave her the space to realize the difference between doing her job and doing what's right. One evening, many months later, she stood by the gate watching passengers board a red-eye flight. A young attendant beside her asked absently, "Do you think we'll ever meet that shareholder lady, the one from the story?" Caroline smiled, a soft curve of humility and memory. "You already have," she said. "You just didn't realize it." Because that was Meredith Winslow's legacy. Not in logos or leadership charts, but in the way people began to pause before passing judgment, in the way service staff stood taller, not from pride, but from purpose. And in the quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful people in the room aren't the loudest, they're the ones who carry grace like armor and walk through the world without needing permission to belong. Her lesson was never shouted, it was lived. And in that living, it echoed further than any announcement ever could.